The sun stood merciless over Cinderluff at high noon, turning the main street into shimmering waves of heat that rose from packed earth like the breath of some subterranean furnace. Grace Ashford, 26 years of age, and widowed these 3 years past, stood on the weathered boardwalk with a bundle of laundered linens balanced on her hip. Her faded calico dress hung loose on a frame, grown thin from worry, and work her hands calloused and reamed from scrubbing clothes on the riverbank every dawn before the town stirred. The street was chaos incarnate. Freight wagons thundered down the rooted road, their drivers drunk on cheap whiskey, despite the early hour rains hanging slack. As the teams ran wild, dust boiled up in choking clouds that turned the air thick and brown. Men shouted curses and laughter from the saloon doorways. Dogs fought over scraps in the alley shadows. At that precise moment, an Apache rider appeared at the far end of the street, materializing from the wavering heat like a phantom conjured from desert mirages. A small boy, no more than 5 or 6 years, clung desperately to the man's belt, and the child's lips pale and gasping, his small body limp with fever or injury. The rider made for Dr. Reed's office with quiet urgency, his face set in grim determination, heedless of the hostility that greeted any Apache in Cinderluff. The lead freight wagon swerved violently, the driver sawing at the reins, too late and too drunk to matter. The horses veered directly into the rider's path. The Apache's mount reared hooves flashing. The boy's feverish grip failed. He tumbled toward the spinning wagon wheel, small arms windmilling helplessly. Grace dropped everything. The laundered linens fell into the dust she had worked hours to wash from them. She lunged forward without thought, without calculation, without the paralysis that might have seized a more cautious soul. Her hands closed on small brown shoulders, and she yanked the child clear with strength born of pure desperation. The wagon wheel spoke, tore her sleeve, and carved a burning line across her forearm, blood welling instantly. But the boy lived. He gasped against her chest, trembling violently. The wagon clattered past the driver, never slowing. Grace sank to her knees in the street, cradling the child, feeling his heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. The Apache rider dismounted swiftly, reaching for his son with hands that shook just slightly. "Señora," he said in Spanish-accented English, the single word carrying more gratitude than 100 speeches. Grace looked up to return the child, and that was when Malcolm Copper, Jim Duffy, stepped from his saloon. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, dressed in an expensive coat despite the heat, his pale blue eyes cold as January ice and twice as merciless. He drew a heavy Colt revolver from beneath his coat with the casual ease of a man drawing breath. "You people clog my road," he said, his voice carrying to every door and window in that suddenly silent street. "You bring your diseases and your dying whelps into my town." He did not fire at the horse. He did not fire at the ground in warning. He aimed at the Apache himself and pulled the trigger with no more hesitation than another man might show swatting a fly. The Apache jerked, as if struck by an invisible fist. His hand flew to his chest, where red bloomed fast and terrible across blue cloth. He fell backward into the street and did not rise, did not speak, did not move again. The boy screamed a high, keening wail that pierced the heart like a blade. Sheriff Edwin Pike stood in a nearby doorway, tin star gleaming on his vest. He looked once at the body crumpled in the dust, at the spreading pool of blood at Copper Jim with his smoking revolver. Then he deliberately looked away, turning to study the horizon as though something infinitely fascinating lay in the empty distance. Copper Jim holstered his weapon with the same casual efficiency and returned to his saloon as though he had done nothing more remarkable than brush dust from his sleeve. The doors swung shut behind him. The street remained frozen for several heartbeats longer. Then life resumed its flow, as though nothing had occurred. The freight wagons continued. The dogs resumed their fighting. Men turned back to their whiskey. But Grace knelt in the bloody dust beside the dead man and the sobbing child. And on a rocky ridge 1/2 mile distant, another Apache, a lean young warrior named Asan, watched it all, with eyes that missed nothing and forgot less. He had come to observe the mine's operations. He had witnessed murder instead, and he had seen a white woman throw herself before a wagon to save an Apache child, an act so unexpected in this town, of casual cruelty that it demanded attention. He marked her face in his memory and turned his horse toward the mountains, carrying news of the killing and the widow's courage to his people. Grace Ashford lived in a leaning cabin on a narrow strip of land beside White River, 3 miles upstream from Cinderluff. Her husband Thomas had staked the claim 7 years prior, drawn by promises of good soil and reliable water. Then 3 years ago, his freight wagon had gone over a washed-out bank during spring floods, and Thomas had died pinned beneath it in cold water, drowning before help could arrive. Copper Jim had appeared at her door not 2 weeks after the funeral, had in hand an expression sympathetic, bearing papers and ledgers and explanations delivered in a voice heavy with regret. Thomas, he explained with apparent sorrow, had died owing the White River Mine Company a considerable sum, freight contracts unfulfilled, equipment purchased on credit, interest accruing. The numbers made her head spin. She had never possessed a talent for figures. She signed where he pointed, because the alternative was immediate eviction, and she had nowhere else to go. Every month since the debt grew, instead of shrank, no matter how she economized or how many extra jobs she took, she accepted laundry from every family in town, mended clothes by candlelight, until her eyes burned, sold vegetables from her garden at prices barely sufficient to cover seed. It was never enough. The chain around her neck tightened with each passing season, drawing tighter and tighter until she could barely breathe beneath its weight. The cabin itself was modest to the point of poverty. 2 rooms with packed earth floors, a smoking fireplace that drew poorly oiled paper in the windows because glass was an unthinkable luxury. Her possessions fit in one battered trunk: 2 dresses, her mother's chipped teacup, Thomas's Bible. A Jarrah type of her parents taken before the Cholera claimed them. She owned a cast-iron skillet, a tin plate, a wooden spoon, nothing more, but the land itself had been good once. The river ran past smooth stones and struggling willows, clear and cold even in summer. She had planted beans and squash and corn, tended them with care, harvested enough to sustain herself through winter, with some left to sell. It had been hard work but honest, and she had taken pride in her independence, even while the debt crushed her. Lately, however, the river had changed. It started subtly, a faint cloudiness to the water, a metallic taste that lingered on the tongue. Then the changes accelerated. The river turned gray and sluggish, carrying a stench like old nails left too long in the rain, like rot and chemicals and death. Fish floated belly up in the shallows, their scales, dull eyes glazed. Her garden plants yellowed, despite careful watering, their leaves spotted with brown. She was not alone in noticing. Dr. Benjamin Reed, whose office occupied a small building near the center of town, treated increasing numbers of patients for stomach ailments and angry rashes that would not heal. Children died of fevers. He could not explain their small bodies racked with convulsions, while he stood helpless, unable to name the poison, much less cure it. He kept careful records, noting dates and symptoms, watching a pattern emerge that pointed upstream toward the mine. Arthur Haynes, who ran cattle on land 5 miles downstream, had lost 5 head in 2 months. The animals would sick and suddenly refuse water despite terrible thirst and die bloated within days. He cut one open, and found its stomach lining eaten away as though by acid. The two men met quietly in Dr. Reed's office one evening after dark, comparing notes by lamplight, speaking in voices kept deliberately low. They knew better than to accuse Copper Jim publicly. He owned the mine, the saloon, the freight line, the general store, and Sheriff Pike's loyalty. He paid workers in company script that could only be spent at his establishments, a rigged arrangement designed to keep people poor and powerless and dependent. The few who had complained about working conditions or unpaid wages had found themselves blacklisted, unable to find work anywhere in the territory. One man who had spoken too loudly about mine safety simply disappeared, his body never found. "The contamination comes from upriver," Dr. Reed said, spreading a hand-drawn map across his desk. "Every case of illness corresponds to water drawn from the river below the mine." "What can they be dumping that would do this?" Arthur asked, his weathered face grim. "Mercury for amalgamation, strong acids to wash the ore. Arsenic compounds. Any or all combined?" Dr. Reed's voice was tight with suppressed fury. "Poured directly into the river because proper disposal costs money. If we bring this to the territorial governor, with what evidence, sick people and dead cattle? Copper Jim will claim its natural causes, bad luck, anything but his responsibility. We need documentary proof, records, witnesses from inside the mine willing to testify." They both knew how unlikely that was. Men feared losing their livelihoods more than they feared poison. But they were not the only ones watching. Upriver from the mine, the White River flowed through territory the Apache had used for generations, camping sites, hunting grounds, sacred springs. When fish began dying and water turned foul, Dawson had followed the contamination to its source. He was a scout trained from childhood to observe and report to read the land's subtle language. He watched the mine for 3 weeks, noting patterns. Long wooden solis carried wastewater down the hillside, dumping gray-brown liquid directly into the river. Barrels were emptied under cover of darkness, their contents spreading downstream like a slow-moving curse. He brought his findings to Chief Nailish, an old man who had survived 3 wars and understood that sometimes survival meant choosing which battles to fight. "If we attack, the mine soldiers will come and destroy us," Nish said heavily, sitting in the shade of a cottonwood in their hidden canyon camp. "Our warriors are too few. Our people are already starving. We need their own law to see what is being done and stop it." Dan had no faith in white men's law. He had seen too many treaties broken, too many promises abandoned. But he knew the chief spoke truth. Open war meant extinction. They needed leverage within the white man's system. Proof that could not be ignored even by corrupt officials. Then Dawson witnessed the street killing. He saw Sheriff Pike look away from murder, and he saw Grace Ashford throw herself before a freight wagon to save an Apache child without hesitation, without calculation, risking her own life for a stranger's son. Small things, he understood, could shift the course of rivers, and sometimes unexpected allies appeared in unlikely forms. He began watching Grace as carefully as he watched the mine, wondering if the white woman with courageous hands might be the leverage his people needed. In Cinderluff itself, life ground forward in its harsh daily rhythm. The mine operated around-the-clock steam machinery, thumping ceaselessly, casting an orange glow against the night sky. Workers descended into darkness at dawn and emerged at dusk, their faces gray with dust, their lungs slowly failing. They lived in company housing, bought supplies at company prices, and died young of accidents or disease replaced immediately by new arrivals, desperate enough to accept any employment. Copper Jim ruled it all from his office, above the saloon, a second-floor room where he kept his ledgers and his whiskey and his iron grip on everything worth owning. He had arrived in Cinderluff 12 years earlier, with money of mysterious origin, purchased the struggling mine at a fraction of its value, and built his empire through ruthlessness disguised as business acumen. He lent money to those who needed it, then called in debts at opportune moments. He offered employment at wages that kept workers perpetually indebted. He controlled information through the telegraph office and violence through Sheriff Pike. Grace knew all this. Every resident of Cinderluff knew it. But knowing changed nothing when you were powerless and alone until the day Copper Jim summoned her to his office. And desperation gave her the courage to commit an act that would change everything. 8 days after the street killing, Grace received a summons delivered by a barefoot boy with frightened eyes. The note was brief. "Come to the mine office before noon. Business cannot wait." Miss Duffy, she knew what it meant. The monthly payment was due, and she was 3 weeks late. She had hoped to earn enough from extra laundry to meet the obligation, but the river's contamination meant fewer people wanted clothes washed in foul water. Her income had dried up like the poisoned river itself. She walked the 2 miles to town as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the heat building, until the air shimmered and wavered. Dust coated her dress and settled in her hair. Sweat ran down her back despite the thin fabric. By the time she reached Cinderluff, her throat was parched and her feet ached. But she straightened her shoulders and climbed the exterior stairs to Copper Jim's office with her head held high. The office occupied the entire second floor above the saloon, a single large room stifling with trapped heat. Heavy furniture loomed in shadow, a massive desk, leather chairs, filing cabinets with brass locks. Copper Jim sat behind his desk in shirt sleeves, his coat discarded collar loosened. A glass of whiskey sat at his elbow despite the early hour. "Your account is overdue, Mrs. Ashford," he said without preamble, not bothering with pleasantries or false sympathy. He waved a crumpled paper at her. 3 months in arrears. The terms of your agreement specify penalties for late payment." Grace's heart sank. She had paid last month, counted out the coins herself, received his grudging acknowledgement. But arguing was futile. Numbers could be changed, receipts could disappear. His word against hers meant nothing. He shoved new papers across the desk toward her, along with a pen and inkwell. "Sign this revised promissory note. I'll extend your deadline through winter. Show of good faith. You might find additional employment to make up the difference." The way he said additional employment, with a slight emphasis and a knowing look, made her skin crawl with revulsion. She forced herself to look at the papers. The new amount was nearly double what she remembered owing. Compound interest, additional fees, late penalties, and the numbers swam before her eyes. But the total was clear enough. She would be in debt until she died. I don't understand how the amount could have increased. "So, compound interest, Mrs. Ashford. It's standard business practice. Surely your husband explained such matters before his untimely death." Copper Jim turned to shout out the window at teamsters loading barrels in the street below his attention, dismissing her objection as irrelevant. Grace's hands trembled as she held the papers. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. But what could she do? She was one woman alone against a man who owned everything. She should sign. She should submit. She should. Her gaze fell on the heavy ledger lying open on his desk, its pages covered in neat columns of figures. While Copper Jim continued shouting out the window, she leaned forward slightly, pretending to study the promissory note while her eyes tracked across the ledger's entries. She should not look. She should mind her own business. But desperation makes thieves of honest people, and she needed to understand how this debt had grown so impossibly large. She found the page, found her name, Ashford Thomas Freight. Contract payment due $150, and below it in red ink, late fee, 25 penalty, 50. Interest, 15% monthly. But there was more, different handwriting, smaller, and more educated in black ink, Along the margin, payment received from White River Mine Company. River access arrangement, $200. Silence maintenance fee, $150. Dart, total $350. Her breath stopped in her chest. She forced herself to keep reading. On the facing page, in that same small, careful hand, widow's debt fabricated. Corresponding amount transferred. Payment documented as loan default. Maintain silence regarding dumping operations. The words struck her like physical blows. Thomas had been paid by the mine, bribed to allow illegal dumping on their land, to turn a blind eye to the poison being poured into the river. When he died, Copper Jim had converted those bribes into a fraudulent debt in her name. The chain choking her for 3 years was built on lies from the beginning. Fury rose in her throat, hot and bitter. But she forced it down, forced her face to remain calm. Copper Jim still shouted at the teamsters, his broad back to her. Her sewing basket sat beside her chair, where she had set it when she entered. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, she set the basket on the ledger's open page, found the paper's edge with trembling fingers, and tore. The binding was old, the stitching brittle. The page came free with only a soft tearing sound lost beneath Copper Jim's shouting. She folded it small and thrust it under her mending, then lifted the basket back to her lap. Her heart hammered so violently she thought it might burst through her ribs. Surely he would hear it. Surely he would turn and see guilt written on her face. But he only finished his shouting and turned back to her, his expression impatient. "Well, are you going to sign or not? I have other matters to attend." Grace stood on trembling legs, clutching her basket. "I need time to consider these terms. I wish to consult Dr. Reed about these figures before signing." Copper Jim's face darkened like a storm cloud. He surged to his feet with surprising speed, for a man his size circled the desk and grabbed her wrist. His fingers dug into flesh, hard enough to bruise his face thrust close to hers. She could smell whiskey on his breath. "You talk to no one. Do you understand? You sign now, or you're off that land by sunset. I'll have Pike drag you off myself if necessary." Grace wrenched her arm free with strength, born of desperation and rage. "I will not sign until I understand what I'm agreeing to. That is my legal right." She turned and walked toward the door, before he could stop her, before her courage failed, before the trembling in her legs gave out entirely. She descended the stairs with measured steps, refusing to run, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. Behind her, Copper Jim stood at the top of the stairs, face purple with rage. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Ashford. You think you can cross me? We'll see how long your pride lasts when you're begging in the street." Grace did not look back. She walked through town with her basket clutched tight, the stolen page burning like coal against her mending, knowing she had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory, and knowing she could not win alone. By evening, Copper Jim discovered a page missing from his ledger. The gap was obvious once he looked. The torn edge stood out against the undamaged binding. He knew immediately what page it was. He knew who had taken it, and he knew she had evidence now that could destroy him if it reached the wrong hands. He summoned 3 of his most reliable men, Rafe, Cullen, Ned Garrett, and Cole Briggs, and gave them simple instructions: retrieve the stolen property by any means necessary. If the widow cooperated, they could let her live to regret her theft. If she resisted, well, accidents happened. They found Grace behind the livery stable at dusk, attempting to purchase oats for her mule from the stable owner, Jacob Warren. The moment Warren saw the 3 men approaching, he grabbed his money box and disappeared into his tack room, barring the door from inside. He wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. The 3 men surrounded Grace in the narrow alley between the stable and the adjoining feed store. The last sunlight slanted between buildings, casting long shadows that turned the space into a canyon of darkness. "You took something from Mr. Duffy," Rafe said, his voice deliberately casual, though his hand rested on his pistol butt. "Something that doesn't belong to you. Hand it over and maybe we forget about your debt entirely. Fresh start. What do you say?" Grace clutched her basket tighter. "I took nothing. You have no right to rights." Rafe laughed a harsh sound without humor. "You think you got rights? You're a widow living on borrowed time. Now hand over that paper before this gets ugly." "Leave her alone," came a quiet voice from the shadows. All four of them turned. Dan stepped into the fading light, having come to town to attempt speaking with Dr. Reed about the sick children in his camp. He had been saddling his horse when he heard raised voices and a woman's protest. Now he stood between Grace and her attackers, his rifle held ready, but not yet aimed. "This ain't your business, Apache," Rafe spat. "Get gone before you end up like that messenger 8 days ago." "Neither is it yours," Dan replied calmly. 3 men surrounding 1 woman. This is not the behavior of warriors. This is the behavior of coyotes. The insult hit home. Ned flushed dark red and reached for his pistol. Dan moved with liquid speed. His rifle butt cracked into Ned's temple, and the man dropped like a felled tree. Before Rafe could draw, Dan reversed the weapon and drove the stock into his gut. Rafe folded with an explosive grunt, vomiting into the dust. Cole turned and ran shouting at the top of his lungs. "Apache attacking white men. Apache's got the widow help murder." Church bells began clanging the alarm for Indian attack. Men grabbed rifles from their homes. Sheriff Pike's voice beamed through the streets, rallying volunteers. "Hostage situation. Arm yourselves." Dan grabbed Grace's hand. "You cannot stay here. They will use this as excuse to hang us both. Come now." For 1 heartbeat, Grace hesitated. Running meant confirming guilt. Running meant losing everything. But the alternative was death, or worse. She let him pull her into motion. They ran through back lots and alleys, vaulting fences, dodging between buildings. Behind them, boots thundered and voices shouted contradictory orders. Someone fired a rifle wildly. The bullets struck a water trough, sending splinters flying. They burst from the town's edge into open scrubland beyond. Behind them, torches flared to life as night fell. The pursuit was organizing mounting horses, forming a proper hunting party. Dan pulled Grace behind a massive sandstone boulder that jutted from the earth like a broken tooth. He pressed her back against warm stone, moved close in front of her, and cupped his hand gently over her mouth. "Shh," he whispered, his face inches from hers in the darkness. "Don't talk. Don't move. They hunt by sound." His chest pressed against her shoulder. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the controlled calm of someone accustomed to danger. His hand on her mouth was warm and calloused, but not rough. He was listening with every sense, head cocked slightly, reading the night the way other men read books. Riders swept past not 30 yards away, so close she could hear saddle leather creaking and horses breathing hard. They passed on either side of the boulder, missing it in the darkness. Dust choked the air. Grace's heart hammered so violently she was certain they must hear it. Dan did not move, did not speak, remained perfectly still. As the search party spread out, calling to each other, firing more shots at shadows and imagination. Only when the sounds faded completely into distance did he lower his hand from her mouth, though he remained close, his voice barely above a breath. "We must reach the river before dawn. They will track us at first light. I can't ask you to. You did not ask. I chose. Now come." He took her hand in the darkness. A practical necessity for moving silently through unfamiliar terrain, and led her deeper into the wilderness, trusting his knowledge of the land to keep them ahead of the manhunt forming behind them. Grace followed her hand in his, trusting him because she had no choice, and because something in his quiet competence told her he would not betray that trust. She had saved an Apache child. Now an Apache warrior was saving her. Perhaps there was justice in that symmetry, or perhaps it was simply chance. Either way, her old life was over. Whatever lay ahead there would be no going back. They walked through the night, across prairie that stretched like an ocean of darkness beneath stars brilliant enough to cast faint shadows. Grace had never traveled so far from Cinderluff, had never ventured beyond the narrow circle of her daily routine. Now she followed an Apache warrior through country that seemed both beautiful and hostile. Every stone a potential twisted ankle, every shadow a possible ambush. Her feet ached terribly in shoes never designed for such distance. Blisters formed and broke and reformed. Her dress, already worn, tore on sagebrush and thorns. Thirst parched her throat despite the canteen Dasan carried, which he insisted she drink for more than he did. But she voiced no complaint, made no plea to stop or slow. Weakness now meant capture. Capture meant death for both of them. Behind them, search parties called to each other, their voices carrying on still night air. Torches bobbed like fireflies in the distance. They were being methodical, spreading out in a search pattern, knowing their quarry could not have gone far on foot. But Dasan knew this land in ways the white men did not. He led Grace through arroyos where their tracks would be hidden by sand, across rock shelves that showed no footprints, through shallow water that broke their scent trail. He moved with patient economy, never hurrying unnecessarily, but never truly resting. This was Apache country before it was American territory, and he had learned its secrets from childhood. At dawn they reached White River, where it ran wide and murky, already fouled by mine waste, even this far upstream. The water rire of chemicals and decay. Dead fish rotted on the banks. Grace stared at the swirling gray current with dread rising in her throat. "I cannot swim," she admitted, her voice small and defeated. Dan studied the water, reading its depth and speed the way she might read a book. Then he whistled sharply, a sound almost like a bird call. A moment later, a paint pony appeared from willows downstream, picking its way delicately through mud. "This is Tozy. He knows this crossing as well as I do." Dan stroked the animal's neck with evident affection. "Hold tight to my waist. Lean when I tell you, trust the horse to find safe footing." He swung up onto the pony's bare back, then pulled Grace up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the muscles of his torso shift as he settled his weight. He was lean but stronger than his build suggested, his body hardened by years of living in harsh country that killed the weak and careless. "Ready," he said, and urged the pony forward. The water hit with shocking cold despite the heat of approaching day. The current pulled at the pony's legs with surprising force, threatening to sweep them downstream toward rapids she could hear roaring somewhere beyond sight. Gray water rose to their thighs, then their waists. The pony struggled, hooves slipping on stones slick with algae and contamination. "Lean left, Dan," commanded sharply. Grace obeyed without thinking. The pony steadied. They pushed deeper. The riverbed dropped away suddenly, and the animal was swimming head high above water legs, churning powerfully. Water soaked Grace's dress, dragging at her like clutching hands. She tightened her grip on Dasan's waist, fighting down panic. The pony stumbled in midstream, its head dipping under briefly. Grace felt Dan shift his weight, felt him lean forward to encourage the animal. "Easy. You know this water. Find the shelf." The horse's hooves struck stone. Found purchase. They were across the deepest channel. The bottom rose slowly beneath them. Another minute of struggling, and they climbed up the far bank water, streaming from horse and riders alike. Grace slid from the pony's back and immediately checked the oilcloth-wrapped page she had concealed inside her bodice. Miraculously, the wrapping had held. The paper was dry, the ink unsmeared. "It's safe," she whispered more to herself than him. Dan nodded. "My people's camp is 2 hours north. You will be safer there. Will they accept me?" He looked at her with an expression difficult to read. That remains to be seen. They pressed on through rising heat, the pony following behind them like a loyal dog. The land grew rougher. Rocky hills gave way to broken country, where water had carved deep channels and wind had sculpted sandstone into fantastic shapes. Hidden in this wilderness, Apache families had survived despite everything thrown against them. The camp lay in a narrow canyon where a spring bubbled between rocks and cottonwood trees grew thick and green, one of the last untainted water sources remaining. Women looked up from grinding corn as Dan arrived with Grace. Children fell silent, staring. Men emerged from wickiups, with weapons ready, their faces hard with suspicion. Chief Nailish sat in the cottonwood shade, filled but still commanding his weathered face, a map of survival. He and Dawson spoke rapidly in Apache, and their voices growing heated. Grace could not understand the words, but she read the body language clearly enough. Young warriors crossed their arms and shook their heads vehemently. An older woman argued passionately, gesturing at Grace with clear hostility. She was risk. She was burden. She would bring soldiers down on people already desperate. "Please," Grace said, stepping forward, though every instinct told her to remain silent. "I understand your suspicion, but we share a common enemy. Copper Jim poisons your water and ruins your hunting grounds. He trapped me in fraudulent debt to keep me silent about his crimes. I have proof." She pulled out the ledger page and held it high. "Proof he bribes officials and forges documents. Proof he violates the law," Dawson translated rapidly. The older woman, who Don would later identify as his Aunt Despa, took the paper and studied it closely, her lips moving as she read the English words. She spoke to Nish in a voice still skeptical but thoughtful. Nish's eyes sharpened as Dasan translated the paper's contents. The chief was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in English for Grace's benefit. "This paper proves their law is broken." "Yes," Grace said firmly. "It proves he paid my husband for illegal access to Riverland. It proves he created false debt. If we bring this to a federal land commissioner or territorial marshal, someone outside Copper Jim's control, they will investigate. Under Repair Aryan Water Rights Law, he cannot contaminate water that others depend on. Under Territorial Fraud Law, he cannot create false debts." A scarred warrior spat near her feet. "White men's law never protects Apache." "Perhaps not." Grace acknowledged, meeting his hostile gaze without flinching. "But it can be used to hurt him. And if Copper Jim falls, the river might heal. Your children might stop dying." Nish considered, his eyes weighing Grace with the same careful judgment he would apply to any potential ally in war. Finally, he nodded once. "You stay for now, but you work. You are in your place and you are watched." It was not welcome, but it was not execution either. Grace nodded her acceptance. Over the following days, she worked to prove herself, mending torn clothing with her skilled hands, preparing meals, fetching water, caring for sick children with remedies Dr. Reed had taught her during her husband's final illness. She moved through the camp quietly, trying not to intrude, trying to be useful without being presumptuous. Dasan was often away scouting the mine's operations. But when he returned, he would sit near her in the evening, sharing news of the search party, still hunting them, of new dumping sites, discovered of Copper Jim's increasing desperation to find them before they could spread word of his crimes. They worked together on a crude map one evening, combining her knowledge of farms and roads with his intimate understanding of game trails and water sources. It was practical work planning, potential routes to reach Granite Pass, where the territorial marshal maintained an office, but trust grew between them through the collaboration built on shared purpose rather than romantic gestures. "Why do you help me?" Grace asked as they worked by firelight. "You could have left me to face Copper Jim's men alone. It would have been safer for you." Dan was quiet for a long moment, adding details to the map with charcoal. "You saved the boy in the street, jumped before that wagon without thinking of your own safety. Any decent person would have done the same." "No." His voice was firm. "Not for an Apache child. Not in that town where our lives mean nothing. What you did was courage, not decency. There is a difference." Grace felt something shift in her chest at those words. "Your people are suffering the same poison I am. That makes us allies." "Yes," he agreed quietly. "But allies can also be friends." Their eyes met in the firelight. Neither spoke further, but something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of connection forged through shared danger and mutual respect. In Cinderbluff, Copper Jim's fury at Grace's escape had turned into cold calculation. He knew the stolen ledger page represented a mortal threat to his business. He moved quickly to hide evidence, dispatching night convoys to haul poisoned waste to scattered remote sites rather than dumping directly into the river. He increased security at the mine, hired additional guards, and spread rumors that the missing widow had gone mad and joined savage raiders. But he also knew that destroying evidence was not enough. He needed to prevent Grace and Dawson from reaching anyone with authority to act on their proof. He sent riders to watch the main road to Granite Pass. He offered doubled rewards, and he began pressuring anyone who might help them. Dr. Benjamin Reed found himself under particular scrutiny. Copper Jim summoned him to the mine office on the pretense of treating an injured worker, then kept him waiting 2 hours in deliberate intimidation. When finally admitted, he found Copper Jim sitting with Sheriff Pike, the two men radiating menace. "I hear you've been asking questions about water quality," Copper Jim said without preamble, making implications, stirring up trouble. Dr. Reed kept his voice level. "I'm a physician. When people sicken in patterns suggesting poisoning from the river water, I document it. That's my professional obligation. Your obligation is to treat patients and keep your theories to yourself." Copper Jim's pale eyes were cold. "Unless you want to find yourself explaining your past to certain interested parties." Dr. Reed's blood ran cold. Copper Jim knew. Somehow he knew. 3 years earlier, when Dr. Reed's wife lay dying of consumption and his debts were crushing, Copper Jim had approached with a proposition $50 more than 2 months' income in exchange for a small favor. Reed would help create documentation, making Grace's fraudulent debt appear legally legitimate. "Just paperwork," Copper Jim assured him. The widow knew about it, understood it was standard practice for settling her late husband's affairs. Dr. Reed had been desperate. He had told himself it was harmless clerical work. He had taken the money and written the transfer notation in his best hand, making bribe payments appear as legitimate debts transferred to the widow's name. His wife had died anyway 3 weeks later. The money was long spent, but the guilt remained growing heavier with each passing month as he watched Grace struggle under the weight of debt he had helped forge. Now Copper Jim leaned back with a satisfied smile. "I still have the receipt with your signature, Dr. Reed. If the territorial authorities start investigating fraud, whose name do you think appears on those documents?" "Not mine. Yours. You'll hang while I walk free." The trap was perfect. If Dr. Reed helped expose Copper Jim, he would expose himself as an accomplice. His reputation would be destroyed. He might face criminal charges. Everything he had tried to atone for would be used against him. But as he walked home through dark streets, Dr. Reed thought of the children dying from poisoned water. He thought of Grace Ashford, who had shown him only kindness despite her own suffering. He thought of his late wife, who had always believed medicine, was about service rather than profit. He made his decision. He spent that entire night writing a detailed confession, every meeting with Copper Jim, every dollar paid, every forged notation, every moment of cowardice and complicity. He dated it signed. It had Arthur Haynes and the minister witnessed it. Then he sealed it in an envelope and gave it to Estelle Kramer at the telegraph office. If anything happens to me, or if federal Zwei authorities investigate the mine, you give them this. He told her, "It's my full confession. It destroys me, but it also destroys Copper Jim's defense that the fraud was standard practice." Estelle took the envelope with trembling hands. Her younger brother had died of mysterious fever the previous winter. She knew what that fever was, now slow poisoning from contaminated water. "Dr. Reed, this will ruin you." "I've been ruined for 3 years," he said wearily. "At least now, I'll have earned it honestly." Estelle made her own decision that night. She composed a carefully coded telegram disguised as a supply order. Urgent priority investigation, land fraud contract violations, riparian water rights, stop White River Mine Company, Cinderluff territory, stop multiple deaths documented, stop federal authority required, stop. She sent it to the territorial marshal's office in Granite Pass, marked urgent. Then she sat in darkness, hands shaking, wondering if she had just signed her own death warrant. But her brother's face haunted her. Some things were worth the risk. Word reached the Apache camp 2 days later. Through Dasan scouts, a large party of Copper Jim's men were moving upriver, searching systematically burning camps and questioning anyone they found about the widow and the rogue Apache. They were getting closer. Chief Nullish called a council. The elders argued heatedly. Some wanted to move camp immediately. Others argued that running would only delay the inevitable. A few young warriors wanted to fight to end this threat with blood. It was Grace who suggested the alternative. "We have proof of Copper Jim's crimes. We've documented his fraud. But it's worthless if it never reaches someone with authority to act. One of us needs to get to Granite Pass while the others draw the search away." Dan shook his head immediately. "If I go to Granite Pass and you stay here, they will find you. If you go alone, you'll be captured before you're 10 mi distant. Then we both go." Grace said, "Leave the camp tonight. Travel fast and light. Reach the marshal before Copper Jim can stop us." Nish considered this with a careful weighing of a man who had survived by choosing battles wisely. "If you both leave, my people are no longer at risk of being destroyed for harboring you. And if you succeed, the mine closes and the river heals if you fail." He shrugged. "We are no worse off than before." They prepared to leave at nightfall. Grace was given moccasins to replace her ruined shoes, a deerskin shirt to replace her torn dress, a water pouch, and travel food. Dan checked his rifle, his knife, his ammunition. They traveled light because speed mattered more than supplies. But Copper Jim had anticipated this move. He had sent men to watch the Apache camp from high ground to observe and report. When Dan and Grace slipped away in darkness, heading west toward the Granite Pass Road, riders shadowed them. The ambush came at a place called Cottonwood Ford, where the White River ran shallow enough to cross easily. Dawn was just breaking, turning the sky from black to pearl. Dan and Grace descended toward the water alert, but not yet alarmed. The first shot came from high ground to their left. The bullet struck stone near Grace's feet, sending splinters flying. Dan shoved her down behind a fallen cottonwood trunk and returned fire in one smooth motion. More shots erupted from multiple positions, and they were surrounded, caught in a carefully prepared kill box. At least 8 men, possibly more, positioned on both sides of the river and on the high ground behind them. "Stay low," Dan commanded, levering fresh rounds into his rifle. "They want us alive if possible, dead if necessary. Don't give them easy targets." A rider broke from cover on the right, galloping toward their position with pistol raised. Grace grabbed the spare revolver Dasan had given her days earlier and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The cylinder was jammed, fouled with mud from the river crossing. Terror spiked through her as the rider's gun swung toward her face. Time seemed to slow. She saw his finger tightening on the trigger, saw the black circle of the barrel centered on her forehead. Then pure instinct took over. She hurled the useless weapon with all her strength. It struck the rider's face with a sickening crack, breaking his nose in a spray of blood. He jerked back, shot going wild, and tumbled from his saddle with a scream. Dan's follow-up shot ensured he stayed down. "Well thrown," Dan said grimly, not looking away from his targets. "But we cannot hold this position. Too exposed. We need higher ground." They scrambled backward up the slope, using every rock and bush for cover. Bullets whined past like angry hornets. One creased Dan's ribs, leaving a bloody furrow that made him grunt, but didn't slow him. Another tore through Grace's sleeve, the heat of its passage burning her skin. Then, from the opposite ridge, unexpected gunfire erupted. Their attackers suddenly found themselves caught between two forces. Confusion spread through Copper Jim's men were there. More Apache head reinforcements arrived. Dr. Reed and Arthur Haynes emerged from cover rifles, barking methodically. They had followed rumors of the search party and positioned themselves to intercept gambling correctly on where an ambush might occur. Caught between attacks from two sides and losing men rapidly, Copper Jim's force broke and fled toward the mine. It was a running retreat, disorganized and panicked, that left 3 dead and 2 wounded behind. In the sudden quiet after gunfire, the survivors gathered. Dan's wound bled steadily, despite Grace's attempt to bind it with torn cloth. Dr. Reed examined it with practiced hands, shallow but bleeding heavily. It needs proper stitching. He looked at Don with an expression mixing guilt and determination. "I have something to tell you both, something that changes everything." He explained his role in creating the fraudulent debt, speaking quickly and without excuses. Grace listened with growing shock and anger, but also with recognition that his confession represented an act of redemption at enormous personal cost. "I've written a full confession," Dr. Reed concluded. "With my testimony in that ledger page, you have proof that cannot be dismissed, but the mine is less than a mile upriver. Copper Jim knows he's losing control. Desperate men do desperate things." Arthur added, "The federal marshal is already on his way from Granite Pass. Estelle got word through 3 days ago. He should arrive within 24 hours, if we can hold out until then." "No." Dan interrupted, his voice, tight with pain, but firm with resolve. "Waiting means Copper Jim has time to destroy more evidence, to flee with his fortune, to spread enough bribes that even federal authority cannot touch him. We must act now. Force a confrontation at the mine, where witnesses can see, where his workers can hear the truth, where he cannot hide." Grace understood immediately what he was suggesting. "We take the fight to him. We expose him publicly in front of his own men with the evidence in hand." "It's suicide," Dr. Reed protested. "He has 50 armed workers at that mine." "He has 50 workers who are slowly being poisoned by his greed," Grace countered. "Workers who live in company houses and buy at company prices and watch their children sicken. If we show them proof of what he's done, show them they've been used and betrayed, some might choose justice over loyalty." It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all they had left. They mounted the captured horses and rode toward the White River mine, carrying their evidence and their courage, knowing they were likely riding toward death, but refusing to turn back. Sometimes victory required willingness to pay the ultimate price. Behind them, the sun rose over a land scarred by greed and watered with blood. And ahead, The mine sprawled across the hillside like a festering wound, awaiting the cauterizing fire of justice. The White River mine sprawled before them in the harsh morning light, a monument to human greed carved into the hillside without regard for consequence. Timber frames marked shaft mouths like rotting teeth. Gray tailings rose in lifeless mounds where nothing would grow for generations. Steam machinery thumped ceaselessly, its rhythm like a dying heartbeat. And there, near a collapsed side tunnel being cleared by tired workers, sat 4 weather-stained crates of dynamite. Even from a distance, Grace could see the danger. The wooden crates were split and stained the dynamite sticks inside, showing the telltale sweating of unstable nitroglycerin leaking through their paper wrappings. One good jolt, one spark, one moment of carelessness, and those crates would detonate with force sufficient to collapse half the mine. A teamster was arguing loudly with the shift foreman near the explosives. "This powder should have been disposed of 6 months ago. Look at it. It's sweating pure nitro. We breathe wrong and it'll blow us all to hell and gone." "Then handle it gentle," the foreman shouted back. "Mr. Duffy says we use what we got till it's gone. He ain't paying for new powder when old powder still works." The argument was interrupted by the arrival of riders. Copper Jim himself emerged from his mine office, a wooden building perched on the hillside above the main works. His face went purple with rage when he saw Grace Dan, Dr. Reed, and Arthur Haynes enter the mine yard. Sheriff Pike appeared behind him, hand dropping to his revolver. Mine workers paused in their labors, sensing violence about to erupt. The entire yard fell silent, save for the relentless thump of machinery. For several heartbeats, no one moved. 60 yards of open ground separated the two groups. Dust drifted between them like a curtain waiting to rise on the final act of a tragedy. Then Grace dismounted deliberately, standing in full view of every worker in that mining yard. She pulled out the ledger page and Dr. Reed's signed confession and held them high where everyone could see. "This is proof," her voice carried across the yard with surprising strength. "Proof that Malcolm Duffy paid my husband Thomas for illegal river access and silence about poisoned waste dumping. Proof he turned those bribes into false debt when Thomas died. Proof he has violated riparian water rights and committed contract fraud." She walked forward slowly, reading aloud for all to hear. "Payment received from White River Mine Company. River access arrangement, $200. Silence maintenance fee, $150. Widow's debt fabricated. Corresponding amount transferred. That's my name. That's my husband's name. That's the debt I've struggled under for 3 years. A debt built on fraud and maintained through lies." Arthur Haynes pried the lid off one of the waste barrels sitting near the crusher shed. He tipped it, pouring gray-brown sludge into the mine's own drinking trough. The liquid steamed faintly, eating away at the wooden trough, giving off a stench of chemicals and death. "This is what he's been dumping upstream." Arthur's voice was hoarse with fury. "Poisoning the water your families drink, killing your children with fever and sickness you can't understand. He saves money on proper disposal by murdering you slowly." Dr. Reed stepped forward, holding up his confession. The morning sun glinted off his spectacles. "I helped him create that false debt 3 years ago. He paid me $50 when I was desperate and grieving. I wrote the transfer notation that made illegal bribes look like legitimate debt. I'm guilty of fraud and forgery." His voice cracked but held steady. "But I am here now to face consequences and tell the truth. Malcolm Duffy has poisoned this land and its people for profit. The evidence is undeniable. Workers looked from the poisoned water, contaminating their own drinking supply, to the ledger page to Dr. Reed's confession to their employer. Doubt and anger showed in faces hardened by years of accepting authority without question. Murmurs spread through the crowd, confusion, recognition growing fury. Sheriff Pike stepped forward, hand extended for the evidence. "You're trespassing on private property. Hand over those documents and leave peacefully, or I'll arrest you for disturbance and theft." Dan moved to block him, rifle raised. "These documents go to the federal marshal in Granite Pass, not to Copper Jim's paid enforcer." Pike's face darkened, his hand dropped to his pistol. "You're threatening a lawman, Apache. That's a hanging offense." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Then a panicked guard named Webb, standing near the dynamite crates and terrified by the escalating violence, drew his revolver with shaking hands. The hammer caught on his coat. He fumbled overcorrected, and the weapon discharged. The bullet struck one of the dynamite crates with a splintering crack. For one breath, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then Grace, understanding with terrible clarity what was about to occur, shouted with all her strength. "Down, everyone! Down the dynamite!" The world exploded. White fire bloomed from the crates, expanding with a roar that drowned thought and sound and sense. The concussive wave knocked men flat like wheat before a scythe. The ground heaved, throwing Grace off her feet. Timber frames shrieked as they shattered. The side tunnel collapsed with grinding thunder. Thousands of tons of rock and earth dropping into darkness. Dan saw it coming in the half-second before detonation, saw the white flash, understood the danger, acted without thought. He threw himself over Grace, twisting so his wounded side took the impact as he drove her to the ground behind an overturned wagon, his arms covering her head, his body shielding hers completely from debris and heat and shrapnel. The wagon above them shuddered under impacts like hail on a tin roof. A timber beam as thick as a man's body flew overhead, missing them by inches. Rocks and metal fragments rained down with force sufficient to kill. Dawson grunted as something struck his back, but he did not move, did not uncover. Grace kept himself between her and death until the shaking stopped and the debris finished falling. When silence descended, a silence so profound after, the deafening roar that it felt like deafness survivors emerged slowly from wherever they had taken cover. The mine was utterly destroyed. The main shaft had collapsed, sealing itself permanently. The waste tunnel lay torn open like a gutted fish, its contents exposed for all to see. Barrels of poisonous sludge, chemical residues the poisoned refugees Copper Jim had been hiding for years. Gray dust covered everything, turning day to twilight. Men coughed and gasped. Some wept. Others simply sat in shock, staring at destruction that had come within inches of killing them all. Dan forced himself to one knee, blood soaking through his shirt from the bullet wound reopened by his fall and from a gash across his back where flying debris had struck. Grace offered her arm, and this time he took it without hesitation, letting her help him stand. "You saved my life," she whispered, seeing the blood, understanding he had deliberately taken injuries meant for her. "You saved the boy in the street," he replied, voice tight with pain. "We are even." Sheriff Pike was fleeing on the nearest horse, spurring it viciously toward the horizon, abandoning his post and his employer in pure self-preservation. And there, pinned beneath a massive timber beam that had fallen across his legs, lay Copper Jim himself. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across dust-covered ground. His face was gray, with shock and agony. Men moved to help him, but stopped when they saw the damage. Both legs crushed bones, visible blood flow too heavy to stop. Dr. Reed moved among injured men with practice deficiency, prioritizing those he could save, offering morphine to those he could not. Arthur Haynes directed workers to line up the intact barrels as evidence to prevent any attempt at hiding what the explosion had revealed. No one argued, no one protested. They had all seen everything now, the poison, the fraud, the casual disregard for human life. Whatever loyalty Copper Jim had commanded through fear and money had evaporated in fire and revelation. Grace knelt beside Copper Jim, just beyond reach of his grasping hands. She felt no pity, only grim satisfaction that justice, however violent and imperfect, had finally arrived. "You're dying," she said quietly. "The federal marshal is already en route from Granite Pass. He'll arrive in hours. If you die without talking, your hired men take the blame. Pike, the foreman, the guards. They'll hang while your name might be forgotten. Tell the truth now, and you die with your crimes acknowledged. Stay silent and die a coward." Copper Jim tried to spit at her, but lacked the strength. His breath came in wet rattles. He looked around at the circle of faces, workers he had exploited and poisoned and worked to death for profit. He saw no sympathy, no mercy, only cold witness. "I paid Ashford." He managed the words, broken by gasping breaths. 200 river access, 150 silence. When he died, made it her debt, kept her quiet. And Sheriff Pike Grace pressed 300 yearly, turned blind eye, the waste dumping cheaper than proper disposal. "Knew people sick, didn't he?" coughed. "Blood didn't care," Dr. Reed wrote rapidly, his hands steady, despite everything documenting the confession with professional precision. 2 workers' men whose children had sickened from poisoned water, signed as witnesses, their faces hard as stone. Copper Jim tried to speak again, but managed only a wet, choking sound. His eyes went distant, fixing on something beyond the dusty sky. The tension left his body like water draining from a cracked vessel. He died there in the ruins of his empire, crushed beneath the weight of the greed that had built it. Grace stood slowly, feeling exhaustion pull at her like gravity around her. The mine burned in places where coal fires had ignited. The machinery stood silent for the first time in years, its relentless heartbeat finally stilled. And from the wreckage, workers began pulling evidence ledgers, barrels, documents Copper Jim had tried to hide. Justice, Grace understood, would not be simple or complete, but it would be real. And sometimes that was enough. Federal Marshal Marcus Henley arrived 3 hours later with 4 armed deputies riding hard from Granite Pass after receiving Estelle Kramer's coded telegram. What he found was a destroyed mine, a dead industrialist, comprehensive documentary evidence, multiple confessions, and 50 witnesses who had seen and heard everything. He was a weathered man in his 50s, gay-bearded and sharpied, who had served 20 years enforcing territorial law in places where law existed more in theory than practice. He had seen every variety of fraud, violence, and corruption the frontier could produce. But the scope of what had occurred at the White River Mine impressed even his jaded sensibilities. He took statements methodically, working through the afternoon and into evening. Dr. Reed's confession, Arthur Haynes's testimony about poisoned cattle and sick families, Grace's stolen ledger page detailing bribes and fraudulent debt conversion, Copper Jim's deathbed admission, witnessed by workers with no reason to lie for a dead employer, physical evidence from the destroyed waste tunnel showing years of illegal dumping, and the testimony of dozens of mine workers who had been slowly poisoned while being told the water was safe. Marshal Henley examined the promissory note bearing Grace's supposed signature, the document that had enslaved her for 3 years. He pulled official land records from his saddlebag and compared them carefully. Then he shook his head. This debt was never properly filed with the Federal Land Office in Granite Pass. Under territorial law, any debt exceeding $100 secured against land must be registered with federal authority to be legally enforceable. This was private paper between Duffy and your late husband, nothing more. When your husband died, Duffy had no legal standing to transfer this alleged debt to you. Even if the debt had been legitimate, which it clearly was not, it died with Thomas Ashford. Grace felt something break inside her chest, not shattering, but releasing. 3 years of crushing weight, simply gone. It was never real. Oh, the debt itself might have existed between Duffy and your husband, but the transfer to you was complete fiction. You had no legal obligation. You could have walked away at any time. Duffy was counting on you not knowing the law. Henley's expression was grim. He did this to dozens of people, kept them trapped through ignorance and fear. Grace looked at Don, who stood nearby, having his wounds properly stitched by Dr. Reed. Their eyes met. She had been a slave to lies. Now she was free, and the man who had helped free her at terrible cost to himself watched her with quiet satisfaction. Marshal Henley's investigation continued for a week. He ordered the mine permanently closed on grounds of deadly neglect of safety and destruction of the land and river. Under Repair Area and Water Rights Law, which protected downstream users from upstream contamination, Copper Jim's dumping operations had violated federal statute. Dozens of civil suits could be filed by affected landowners and families. Sheriff Pike was tracked down 2 days later, trying to flee into Mexico. He was returned to Granite Pass in chains to face charges of accepting bribes, ignoring felonies, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His trial would be brief, and his sentence lengthy. Dr. Reed faced territorial proceedings for his role in creating fraudulent documents, but his voluntary confession, his cooperation with federal authority, and his years of service treating the Territo's poor earned him leniency. He retained his medical license, but would work under supervision for 2 years. More importantly, he worked tirelessly in the months following to document recovery efforts and treat ongoing effects of poison exposure. He would carry the shame of his mistake publicly, but he would also earn back trust through action rather than words. Grace was issued a new deed by federal authority, clean, legitimate, with no debt attached. The cabin and riverside land were hers absolutely. The document was signed by Marshal Henley himself and registered properly in Granite Pass. No one could take it from her now. No one could use her ignorance against her. For several days after the mine's destruction, she could only sit and stare at that deed touching the official seal, unable to fully comprehend that the nightmare had ended. Cinderbluff changed in the months that followed. The company's store, no longer protected by Copper Jim's monopoly, faced competition from 3 new merchants who offered fair prices and real currency instead of script. Mine workers scattered to seek employment elsewhere or staked claims of their own, trying to build honest livings from hard country. The saloon remained but under new ownership that prohibited serving visibly drunk patrons during daylight hours. Estelle Kramer continued operating the telegraph office, but now she sent messages without fear of reprisal. Her courage in contacting federal authority had not been forgotten. She became something of a local heroine, proof that one person acting with moral courage could shift the course of history. Grace returned to her cabin and rebuilt with help from Apache men who came to assist and from townspeople who had benefited from her exposure of Copper Jim's crimes. She straightened sagging walls, replaced the leaking roof, added a small shed that served as a stable and weigh station where anyone could water horses freely, regardless of background. The river healed slowly. Fish began returning as cleaner water flushed downstream. The chemical smell faded month by month. Plants along the banks grew green again. Dr. Reed tested water samples weekly, documenting steady improvement. He estimated full recovery would take 3 to 5 years, but the trend was undeniable. The poison was being washed away. Marshal Henley, before returning to Granite Pass, made one final legal declaration. He officially designated Grace's property as a shared watering place on federal maps neutral ground, where Apache families and white settlers alike could stop to water animals and refill canteens as long as they respected simple rules of common courtesy. It was a small gesture, but symbolically powerful in a territory where such cooperation was rare. Apache families began camping near her land again in traditional seasonal patterns. Women taught Grace to identify edible plants and prepare foods that didn't require scarce supplies from town. Children gradually lost their shyness, playing near her cabin while their mothers worked. She learned a handful of Apache words, and they learned bits of English building communication through practical necessity and genuine respect. And Dawson came often, very often indeed, at first ostensibly to ensure his people could use the river crossing safely and to coordinate with Dr. Reed about treating remaining illness from contamination. But the visits lengthened, and their nature changed. He would arrive at dusk, unsaddle his pony toy in her shed, with easy familiarity, sit by her fire as darkness fell. They spoke of weather and water, quality of politics in Granite Pass, and tensions with other Apache bands. He taught her to read tracks in mud and identify animals by their signs. She taught him which farmers could be trusted and which traders offered fair deals. Their bond grew not from romantic declarations or grand gestures. Those belonged to a different kind of story. Instead, it was built on trust earned through hardship, respect forged through witnessing each other at their worst and their finest. It was built on the memory of him whispering, "Shh, don't talk," while pressed against her in hiding, of her throwing a useless gun at a man about to kill them, both of him, covering her body with his own to shield her from an explosion that could have killed them both. It was built on survival and partnership, on choosing to stand together when standing alone would have been fatal. One evening, 3 months after the mine's destruction, Grace stood washing a pot at the river's edge. The water ran clear and cold now, nearly restored to what it had been before Copper Jim's greed poisoned it. The sky was turning amber and gold as the sun descended behind western hills. Dan came to stand beside her, his moccasins silent on smooth stones. He took the pot from her hands and set it carefully on the bank. Then he simply stood close, his shoulder nearly touching hers, looking out over the flowing water. The silence between them was comfortable, full of things that needed no words. Grace turned to look at him. This Apache warrior, who had risked everything to help a white widow he barely knew who had been shot defending her, who had thrown himself between her and death without hesitation. His face was weathered from years living in harsh country, his body marked with scars earned through courage. But his eyes, when they met hers, were gentle. "You saved my life," she said softly. "You saved the boy in the street," Dan replied. "You saved the river. You saved yourself." "We did it together," she corrected gently. He took her hand deliberately. Not a casual touch, but a conscious gesture carrying weight. "I am staying," he said quietly, his English careful and formal. "Here on this land near you. If you will have me. My people know where to find me. But this is where I choose to be." Grace felt her heart expand in her chest, warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the setting sun. "Yes," she said simply, "I want you here. I want to build something lasting together on this land we fought for." There were no passionate embraces, no theatrical declarations. Such things belonged to a world neither of them inhabited. Instead, Dawson's hand tightened on hers, warm and calloused and strong. Grace leaned against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid reality of his presence. They stood together on the bank of the river they had reclaimed, watching clear water flow toward distant hills. Behind them, smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, carrying the smell of bread baking. Around them, the land was healing scars, fading slowly under patient care. Somewhere, a coyote howled, answered by another far away. The first stars appeared in deepening blue. The day's heat faded into pleasant coolness. Dan's arm came around Grace's shoulders, drawing her closer. She wrapped her arm around his waist, mindful of his healing wounds. They fit together with the ease of partnership earned rather than assumed. "The marshal told me I was free," Grace said quietly, "that the debt was never real, that I could have left at any time if I'd known the law." "But you did not know," Dan replied, "and now you do. Knowledge is also freedom." "Yes." She looked up at him, this man who had become so essential to her survival and her future. "But the freedom matters less than who I'm choosing to share it with." "Choose carefully," he said with the faintest hint of humor warming his voice. "Apache men are difficult, stubborn, set in their ways." Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy that surprised them both. "Then we are well matched. Widowed white women are notoriously difficult as well." They stood together as darkness deepened and stars multiplied overhead, guardians of hard-won peace in a harsh land. Partners equal in courage, and bound by trust and respect and something deeper that required no name because it was proven through action rather than declared through words. The river flowed clear beside them, carrying away the last traces of poison, bearing silent witness to their triumph and their promise. And everything that had been broken through greed and violence had been made whole through courage and sacrifice and love that was earned, minute by minute, day by day, through choosing to stand together. When the world offered every reason to stand apart, behind them, the cabin waited warm and solid home. In the truest sense, not just a building, but a place where two people had chosen to build a life together on ground soaked with blood and made sacred through suffering. Before them lay a future uncertain, but faced together whatever trials might come. Grace thought of the woman she had been 3 years ago, trapped, ignorant, slowly suffocating under false debt. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that justice sometimes required courage more than law. That survival sometimes required alliances that crossed boundaries of race and custom. That the most valuable things in life, freedom, trust, love, could never be given, but only earned. She looked at Dasan one more time in the starlight. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He shook his head slightly. "We thank each other by living well, by making this land a place where others can also find justice and clean water, by proving that different people can stand together when they choose courage over fear." "Yes," Grace agreed. "That's exactly right." They turned together and walked back to the cabin hand in hand, carrying the day's water, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Behind them, the river flowed eternal under stars, brilliant enough to guide travelers home. The land stretched away in all directions, vast and harsh and beautiful and unforgiving, and full of promise for those brave enough to claim it. And somewhere in the darkness, other eyes watched Apache scouts making note of the white woman and the warrior who had chosen to live in peace. Settlers observing that perhaps cooperation offered better odds of survival than conflict travelers, who would remember that this place offered water freely to all who came in peace. The story of the widow and the warrior would spread, carried by word of mouth across the territory, told around campfires and in saloons, growing with each retelling, but remaining true in its essential core. That courage existed in unexpected places. That justice sometimes required sacrifice, and that the strongest bonds were forged not in